The heavy, suffocating scent of white lilies will forever make my stomach turn. For most people, a funeral is a sacred time for mourning, a quiet moment for a family to come together, lean on one another, and share the profound weight of a devastating loss. But for my older sister, Evelyn, our father's funeral was nothing more than a scheduled business transaction. It was the final hurdle she had to clear before she could claim the prize she had been waiting for. To truly understand the sheer cruelty of what happened on that rainy Tuesday afternoon, you have to understand what the last 10 years of my life actually looked like. When I was 22 years old, freshly graduated from college and ready to take on the world, my life came to a sudden, screeching halt. Our father, the strong, vibrant man who had raised us single-handedly after our mother passed away, was diagnosed with a severe, fast-progressing degenerative illness. The doctors told us he would eventually lose his mobility, his independence, and require round-the-clock care. I remember sitting in that sterile doctor's office, the world spinning around me, waiting for my older sister to tell me we would get through this together. Instead, Evelyn packed her designer bags less than a week later and moved to Europe. She claimed she had a once-in-a-lifetime career opportunity in Paris that she simply couldn't pass up. She promised she would send money, hire nurses, and visit every holiday. It was all a lie. For a decade, my entire universe shrank to the size of my father's bedroom. I didn't get to build a career, travel, or fall in love. While my friends were out getting promoted, getting married, and buying their first homes, I was learning how to administer intravenous medications, mastering the complicated mechanics of a wheelchair lift, and holding my father's trembling hand through the darkest, most agonizing hours of the night. I watched the strongest man I knew slowly fade away. I did it willingly, with a heart full of love, because he was my dad and he needed me. And where was Evelyn during those 10 grueling years? She was living a life of absolute luxury across the Atlantic. My social media feed was a constant, bitter reminder of her reality, sipping expensive champagne on yachts in Monaco, skiing in the Swiss Alps, and attending exclusive fashion shows in Milan. She never sent a dime for his medical bills. She never hired that nurse. She only ever called the house when she had overdrawn her accounts and needed Dad to wire her money to cover her extravagant lifestyle. Whenever I begged her to come home, to just sit with him for a few days so I could sleep, she always had an excuse. "I'm closing a huge deal, Clara," she would say, her voice dripping with annoyance. "I can't just drop everything because his joints ache." Then, 2 days ago, my father took his final breath. He passed away quietly in his sleep, holding my hand. When I called Evelyn to break the news, there was no sobbing on the other end of the line. There was just a long pause, followed by a crisp, cold response. "I'll book a first-class flight. Don't touch any of his financial documents until I get there." She arrived at the funeral looking like she had just stepped off the cover of Vogue. She wore a tailored black designer dress, oversized dark sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't shed a single tear as they lowered him into the ground. She just checked her diamond-encrusted watch and complained to me about the humidity ruining her hair. I was so exhausted, so deeply drained from a decade of caregiving and the crushing grief of losing my best friend, that I didn't even have the energy to argue with her. I just wanted to go back to our childhood home, sit in his favorite armchair, and finally allow myself to break down. But Evelyn had other plans. After the burial, we hosted a small reception at the family house. I spent hours mechanically serving coffee and thanking distant relatives for their condolences, moving like a ghost through the hallways I had cleaned every day for 10 years. Finally, the front door clicked shut behind the last departing guest. The house fell into a heavy, deafening silence. I let out a long breath, kicking off my uncomfortable black shoes, ready to collapse onto the sofa. That was when Evelyn walked into the living room, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She wasn't alone. Trailing closely behind her was a tall, slick-looking man in an expensive gray suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase. He didn't look like family, and he certainly didn't look like a grieving friend. "Evelyn?" I asked, my voice hoarse and exhausted. "Who is this?" "The reception is over." Evelyn took off her sunglasses, her piercing blue eyes devoid of any warmth or sorrow. She offered me a cold, calculated smile that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "This isn't a guest, Clara," she said smoothly, gesturing for the man to set his briefcase down on the coffee table. "This is Mr. Vance. He's my attorney. And since you're already here, we figured there is no better time than the present to read Dad's final will and discuss your immediate eviction." The word eviction hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, completely drowning out the sound of the rain tapping against the living room windows. I stared at Evelyn, my brain desperately trying to process what she had just said. My father's body was barely cold. The dirt on his grave hadn't even settled, and the smell of the funeral arrangements still permeated the very room we were standing in. Yet here was my own flesh and blood, flanked by a stranger in a tailored suit, treating our childhood home like a distressed asset waiting to be liquidated. "Eviction?" I echoed, my voice trembling, though whether from exhaustion or rising panic, I couldn't tell. "Evelyn, what are you talking about? Dad just died today. Can we please not do this right now? I haven't slept in 3 days." Evelyn sighed, a harsh, dramatic sound of manufactured impatience. She gracefully sat down on the pristine white leather sofa, a sofa I had spent hours scrubbing clean every week, and crossed her long, elegant legs. "Let's not drag this out with unnecessary emotional theatrics, Clara," she said, waving her manicured hand dismissively toward the slick man standing beside her. "Mr. Vance is a very busy man, and his hourly rate is astronomical. Go ahead, Mr. Vance. Read her the document." Mr. Vance didn't offer a sympathetic smile or a word of condolence. He simply placed his expensive leather briefcase on the antique coffee table, popped the brass latches, and pulled out a crisp, pristine ivory envelope. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie before pulling out a few sheets of thick legal paper. "This is the last will and testament of your father, dated exactly 2 months ago," Mr. Vance began, his voice carrying a practiced, mechanical cadence. 2 months ago? My heart skipped a beat. A cold wave of dread washed over me. 2 months ago, my father's degenerative illness had progressed so severely that he couldn't even recognize me some mornings, let alone dictate complex legal documents. He didn't have the motor function to hold a glass of water, let alone grip a pen to sign a legally binding contract. I listened in absolute, paralyzed horror as Mr. Vance read through the dense legal jargon. With every sentence he spoke, the foundation of my entire life was systematically dismantled. According to this piece of paper, my father stated that he was of entirely sound mind and body. It claimed that he was leaving the entirety of the estate, the historic 4-bedroom house, the family trust fund, and all remaining liquid assets to his eldest daughter, Evelyn, citing her exceptional financial vision and ability to preserve the family legacy. "And as for you, Clara," Mr. Vance continued, not even bothering to look up from the page, "the document stipulates a one-time disbursement of $5,000. It is explicitly labeled here as, quote, retroactive compensation for general caregiver and housekeeping duties rendered over the past decade." The room started spinning. I literally felt the blood drain from my face. $5,000. 10 years of my life. 10 years of sleepless nights, of giving up my 20s, of wiping tears, changing bedsheets, and managing agonizing medical crises, completely alone. 10 years of sacrificing my own future out of pure, unconditional love for our father, reduced to a $5,000 severance package. It wasn't just an insult, it was a total erasure of my existence as his daughter. They had categorized me as nothing more than a cheap, expendable maid. "This is a joke," I whispered, my hands balling into fists at my sides. I stepped forward, glaring directly at Evelyn, who was busy inspecting a minor chip in her nail polish. "This is a forged document. Dad couldn't even hold a pen 2 months ago. His hands shook so badly he couldn't feed himself. You weren't even in the country, Evelyn. How could he possibly have met with this sleazy rent-a-lawyer to draft this?" Mr. Vance stiffened, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second, but Evelyn just laughed. It was a short, sharp, and utterly joyless sound. Watch your tone, Clara, Evelyn warned, standing up and closing the distance between us. She towered over me in her designer heels, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. Dad had moments of absolute clarity. He realized, right at the end, that leaving a multi-million-dollar estate to a woman who hasn't held a real corporate job in a decade would be a tragic mistake. You have no ambition. You have no idea how the real world operates. He knew I was the only one capable of handling real wealth. She snatched the crisp document from Mr. Vance's hands and practically shoved it into my chest. Here is the reality of your situation, Evelyn hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. I am the sole executor of this estate. And frankly, this massive house is a money pit that I have zero intention of keeping. I have a very lucrative, all-cash buyer flying in from New York to sign a purchase agreement this Friday. They want the property completely empty. Friday? I choked out, looking at the grandfather clock in the hall. Evelyn, it's Tuesday evening. I have lived here for my entire life. All of my belongings, all of Dad's memories. You are giving me 2 days to move out. I'm giving you exactly 48 hours, she corrected coldly, walking toward the front door. Take your $5,000, pack your cheap sweaters, and find a cheap apartment somewhere. If you're not out by Thursday night, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing on my property. She didn't look back. She just opened the door, stepping out into the pouring rain while Mr. Vance scrambled to hold an umbrella over her head. The door clicked shut, leaving me standing completely alone in the center of the living room, clutching a fraudulent piece of paper that had just destroyed my entire life. They thought they had broken me. They thought I would collapse onto the floor, weeping in helpless despair while they stole my father's legacy right out from under me. But as the sound of Evelyn's luxury town car faded down the street, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a deep, terrifying calm. Evelyn was incredibly arrogant, and arrogance breeds fatal mistakes. She thought she knew everything about our father's final years because she threw money at a fake lawyer to forge a will 2 months ago. But she had no idea what my father and I had actually done 5 years ago, when his mind was perfectly sharp and his disappointment in her was crystal clear. Part 3. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dimly lit living room, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. In my trembling hand, I held the thick, ivory-colored paper that Mr. Vance had so casually tossed at me. The forged will. The document that effectively erased a decade of my blood, sweat, and tears. I read over the words again, my eyes lingering on the specific clause that reduced my entire existence, my endless sacrifices, to a meager $5,000 payout for general housekeeping duties. Evelyn wanted me to break. She had engineered this entire ambush perfectly, striking when I was at my absolute lowest, physically exhausted from the funeral and emotionally shattered by our father's passing. She expected me to collapse onto the floor, weeping hysterically, begging her to let me stay in my childhood bedroom. She thrived on that kind of power. But as the minutes ticked by, the crushing weight of grief in my chest was slowly replaced by a completely different sensation. It was a cold, sharp, and incredibly focused anger. I walked over to the grand fireplace and gently placed the fraudulent will on the mantel, right next to a framed photograph of my father. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I needed to keep it pristine because it was the exact piece of evidence I would soon use to destroy Evelyn's entire carefully constructed life. Evelyn was glamorous, yes. She was manipulative, certainly. But she was also profoundly arrogant, and arrogance almost always leads to catastrophic blindness. She was in such a desperate rush to liquidate this house because, despite her designer clothes and her tales of European luxury, I knew the truth. Over the past year, her frantic phone calls to our father demanding money had become increasingly hysterical. She wasn't a successful businesswoman in Paris. She was drowning in massive, unmanageable debt, likely dodging creditors who were threatening to seize her assets. She needed millions of dollars in cash, and she needed it immediately to save herself from bankruptcy. That was why she had a cash buyer flying in on Friday. She was treating our family's legacy like a pawn shop transaction. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I stayed home to care for our father, I was naive, uneducated, and entirely clueless about legal affairs. She assumed that our father's mind had been gone for years. What Evelyn didn't know, what absolutely no one in her superficial social circle knew, was what happened in this very house exactly 5 years ago. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. It was a bright, sunny afternoon. Dad was still in the early stages of his illness, confined to a wheelchair but still possessing a mind as sharp as a diamond. He had asked me to wheel him into his study and close the heavy oak doors. Sitting across from his desk wasn't a sleazy, rented attorney like Mr. Vance. It was Arthur Sterling, a formidable, fiercely loyal senior estate lawyer who had been my father's closest friend and advisor for over 30 years. That afternoon, my father looked me dead in the eyes, his voice steady and unwavering. "Clara," he had said, "Evelyn called again today. She wanted me to leverage the house to fund another one of her doomed ventures." I told her no, and she screamed at me. She showed me her true colors today. I know exactly what she will try to do the moment I close my eyes for good. She will try to throw you to the wolves. Dad didn't just draft a new will. That day, he knew a standard will could be contested in probate court, tied up in expensive legal battles by Evelyn's aggressive lawyers for years. Instead, with Arthur Sterling's meticulous guidance, my father established an irrevocable living trust. He legally, permanently transferred the deed of the house, the family business shares, and every single cent of his liquid assets directly into that trust, naming me as the sole, undisputed trustee. I didn't just inherit this house. For the last 5 years, I had legally owned it. Furthermore, knowing Evelyn would likely try to claim he wasn't in his right mind, Arthur had set up a professional camera in the study. We recorded a high-definition, 45-minute video of my father. In that video, he clearly stated his full name, the exact date, and his explicit intent. He detailed Evelyn's financial recklessness, her abandonment of the family, and his deliberate decision to leave her absolutely nothing. He ended the video by looking straight into the lens and stating that any future documents produced under his name, especially any new wills, should be considered completely fraudulent and the result of coercion. Evelyn's 2-month-old fake will wasn't just void, it was a criminal offense. I opened my eyes, looking around the quiet, empty living room. A genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in days. Evelyn had given me a 48-hour deadline to pack up my entire life. So, I decided to be the obedient, terrified little sister she expected me to be. I walked down to the basement and dragged up a dozen heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes. I brought them right into the main hallway, highly visible to anyone who walked through the front door. But I didn't pack a single family photo. I didn't pack my clothes or my father's precious antique book collection. Instead, I spent the next 3 hours methodically filling those boxes with old newspapers, heavy stacks of junk mail, and useless scrap paper from the recycling bin. I taped them up tightly with thick packing tape, giving them the perfect illusion of weight and substance. By the time the sun began to rise on Wednesday morning, the foyer looked exactly like the staging ground of a defeated woman preparing to surrender her home. Everything was perfectly set. I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, crawled under the heavy duvet, and for the first time since my father passed away, I slept peacefully. I had 48 hours to wait. Friday was coming, and Evelyn was about to walk blindly into a trap made of her own insatiable greed. When I woke up late Wednesday morning, the heavy rainstorm had passed, leaving a deceptive, bright calm over the neighborhood. My phone was already buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. There were 5 text messages from Evelyn, each one a masterclass in blistering entitlement. Make sure the master bedroom is completely cleared by tomorrow. Don't try to take any of the antique furniture. The buyer wants the house fully staged. I hired a junk removal crew for your garbage. Be ready. I spent the early afternoon strategically placing my fake, paper-filled moving boxes right in the center of the main hallway. At around 3 o'clock, Evelyn let herself in. She didn't bother to knock or announce her arrival. She simply marched through the front door holding a leather clipboard, flanked by an incredibly anxious-looking interior staging consultant. Evelyn walked right past me as I was carefully taping up a box, not even offering a polite hello. She treated me like a hired laborer who was moving too slowly. "We need to tear out these heavy drapes," Evelyn instructed the consultant, aggressively pointing her manicured finger at the vintage, emerald velvet curtains our mother had hand-sewn decades ago. The VIP buyer is flying in from Manhattan. He wants a modern, open-concept aesthetic. All this depressing, old-world clutter has to go immediately. She finally stopped her pacing and looked down at me. I intentionally let my shoulders slump, wiping a fake sheen of sweat from my forehead, playing the exhausted victim to absolute perfection. "I'm making progress, Evelyn," I murmured, pitching my voice to sound defeated and breathless. I need a little more time to sort through Dad's study. There are so many memories." Evelyn scoffed, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "You don't need time, Clara. You need efficiency. Throw it all in black garbage bags for all I care." The buyer is arriving at exactly 2 o'clock on Friday to sign the preliminary purchase agreement and transfer the earnest money. I am hosting a catered champagne lunch right here in the dining room to seal the deal. I want you and your depressing little boxes completely gone before the caterers arrive. I simply nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "Okay, Evelyn. I'll be out of your way." Thursday felt like the longest, most agonizing day of my entire life. While Evelyn was busy ordering expensive floral arrangements and premium imported caviar on credit she clearly didn't actually have, I slipped into my father's old study and locked the heavy oak doors behind me. I sat down at his massive mahogany desk, running my fingers over the polished wood, drawing strength from his memory. I picked up the heavy brass telephone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Sterling Estate Law, how may I help you?" the receptionist answered. "This is Clara," I said, my voice dropping its frail facade, instantly becoming steady and sharp. "Put Arthur on the line. It is an absolute emergency." When Arthur Sterling's deep, gravelly voice came on the line, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. I told him about the funeral ambush, the sleazy Mr. Vance, the forged will dated 2 months ago, and Evelyn's frantic plan to liquidate the multi-million-dollar estate to a cash buyer the very next afternoon. I could practically hear Arthur's jaw clench over the phone line. "A forged will," he growled, the fierce, protective loyalty he had harbored for my father instantly igniting into a blazing fury. "She is playing an incredibly dangerous, criminal game, Clara. Does she have any idea about the irrevocable trust? Does she know the deed is already in your name?" "She has absolutely no idea," I replied, a cold, calculated smile finally forming on my lips. "She thinks I am currently packing my entire life into cardboard boxes for a $5,000 severance check. She thinks she has completely won." "Let her keep thinking that," Arthur said, his tone shifting from shock into the ruthless, predatory confidence of a lawyer who had never lost a major battle. "I have the original trust documents, the updated county deed, and the secure USB drive with Thomas's video confession. I will be at the house tomorrow at exactly 1:45. We are going to let her set her beautiful stage, Clara. And then we are going to burn her entire theater to the ground." When I hung up the phone, the final, lingering pieces of my grief-stricken anxiety completely dissolved. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was the guardian of my father's legacy, and I was going to protect it with lethal precision. Friday morning arrived with bright, blinding sunlight. Evelyn showed up at 10 o'clock sharp, barking frantic orders at a team of nervous caterers who were setting up a lavish spread of crystal champagne flutes and silver platters in our grand dining room. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own success, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. She saw me walking down the hallway in a faded, oversized sweatshirt and sneered. "Your Uber is arriving in 2 hours, Clara. Do not make a scene, and don't let the door hit you on the way out." I gave her one last, submissive nod and walked slowly up the stairs to my bedroom. I closed the door, listening to the clinking of expensive crystal downstairs. But I didn't pack a single bag. I walked into my closet, reached into the very back, and pulled out a sharp, tailored navy blue power suit. The time for playing the broken, weeping caregiver was officially over. Part 5. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, my fingers slowly buttoning the jacket of my tailored navy blue suit. The transformation was startling. Gone was the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman who had spent a decade wearing faded cardigans and practical, rubber-soled shoes. Staring back at me was a woman forged in the fires of unimaginable grief and absolute betrayal. I applied a sharp coat of crimson lipstick, ran a brush through my hair, and took one final, deep breath. The scent of sickness and sorrow that had haunted this room for years seemed to completely evaporate, replaced by an electric current of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Downstairs, the heavy oak front door chimed. The VIP cash buyer had arrived. I cracked my bedroom door open just an inch, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps as I moved to the edge of the second-floor landing. From the shadows of the grand mahogany staircase, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the dining room below. It looked like a scene pulled straight out of a billionaire's lifestyle magazine. The antique table was covered in crystal champagne flutes, delicate silver platters of caviar, and imported cheeses. Evelyn was in her absolute element. She was wearing a stunning, bone-white designer dress, her neck draped in heavy gold jewelry that likely cost more than a luxury car. She let out a high, musical, and entirely fake laugh as she shook hands with an older, distinguished-looking man in a bespoke suit, the cash buyer. Standing right behind her, looking like a predatory shark scenting blood in the water, was Mr. Vance, the sleazy attorney who had produced the forged will. Mr. Harrington, I cannot express how thrilled I am to pass this historic property into your capable hands, Evelyn practically purred, gesturing grandly around the room. My father always envisioned this space being modernized by someone with true architectural vision. It's a magnificent estate, Evelyn, Mr. Harrington replied, pulling out his reading glasses. And I appreciate your willingness to expedite the closing process. My development firm is eager to break ground. Efficiency is my specialty, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with a greedy, desperate hunger that she was barely managing to conceal. She was literally minutes away from securing a massive, non-refundable, multi-million-dollar cash deposit. A deposit she desperately needed to wire overseas to save herself from criminal fraud charges and bankruptcy. Mr. Vance stepped forward, clicking open his expensive briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and laid them perfectly straight on the dining table. The preliminary purchase agreement is in order, Mr. Harrington. As the sole legal executor and inheritor of the estate, Evelyn just needs to sign on the dotted line, and the wire transfer can be initiated immediately. Evelyn picked up a heavy, gold-plated Montblanc pen. A caterer stepped forward, popping the cork on a bottle of vintage champagne, the celebratory sound echoing off the high ceilings. Evelyn smiled, a look of absolute, triumphant victory washing over her face. She leaned over the mahogany table, the tip of her pen hovering just a millimeter above the signature line. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought the finish line was right in front of her. I didn't wait another second. I pushed away from the shadows of the landing and began my descent down the grand staircase. I didn't try to be quiet. With every step, the sharp, authoritative click of my heels echoed like gunshots through the cavernous foyer. Click, click, click. The celebratory chatter in the dining room instantly died. The caterer froze with the champagne bottle halfway poured. Evelyn, Mr. Harrington, and Mr. Vance all whipped their heads toward the staircase. Evelyn's eyes widened in absolute shock. Her jaw physically dropped. She was expecting the timid, broken sister in a baggy sweatshirt, dragging a cheap suitcase to a waiting Uber. Instead, she was looking at a woman radiating total corporate authority, wearing a power suit that rivaled the VIP buyers. Clara, Evelyn hissed, her voice cracking, the polished, high society facade slipping instantly. She quickly recovered, her face flushing with sudden, ugly rage. She slammed the pen down on the table. What on earth are you doing? I told you to be gone by noon. You are trespassing. Get upstairs and get out the back door before I call the police. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my posture perfectly straight, my expression cold and entirely unreadable. I didn't even look at Evelyn. I locked eyes directly with the cash buyer. Mr. Harrington, I sincerely apologize for the interruption and for the massive waste of your valuable time, I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the grand room. But I highly recommend you put your checkbook away. The woman standing next to you has absolutely no legal right to sell you this property. Mr. Harrington frowned, visibly confused, taking a step back from the table. Excuse me? What is the meaning of this? Evelyn, you assured me the title was clear. Mr. Vance aggressively stepped forward, pointing a finger at me. Listen here, little girl. This is a private legal transaction. Evelyn is the sole executor of the will. If you don't leave this premises immediately, I will have you arrested for criminal harassment. You won't be having anyone arrested, Mr. Vance, a deep, booming voice thundered from the foyer behind me. Right on cue, the heavy front door swung open. Arthur Sterling walked in. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a force of nature. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray three-piece suit, gripping his thick leather briefcase like a weapon. He moved past me and marched straight into the dining room, exuding a terrifying, unquestionable authority that immediately made Mr. Vance take a nervous step backward. Evelyn's face turned the color of ash. Who the hell are you? She stammered, gripping the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned white. Arthur didn't even blink at her outrage. He stopped right at the head of the table, directly across from the forged paperwork. He dropped his heavy briefcase onto the mahogany wood with a loud, final thud. My name is Arthur Sterling, senior partner at Sterling Estate Law, he announced, his voice dripping with pure, concentrated ice. And I am here representing my client, the sole, legal, and undisputed owner of this entire estate, Clara. Part 6. The silence in the dining room was so profound that I could actually hear the tiny bubbles popping in the freshly poured crystal champagne flutes. Evelyn stared at Arthur Sterling as if he were a ghost that had just materialized from the floorboards. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her expensive designer makeup looking like a grotesque, pale mask. Mr. Vance, however, was clearly not used to being challenged. He puffed out his chest, aggressively adjusting his silk tie in a pathetic attempt to regain control of the room. He let out a condescending, nasally laugh, though a bead of sweat was already forming at his temple. I don't know what kind of amateur hour scam you two are trying to pull, Mr. Vance sneered, tapping his manicured finger sharply against the forged will on the table. But I hold in my hand the final, legally binding last will and testament of the deceased, signed and dated just 2 months ago. It supersedes any outdated, irrelevant paperwork you might have in that antique briefcase of yours. Evelyn is the sole executor. Now, both of you need to get out before I call security and have you removed. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Mr. Vance with the kind of absolute, chilling pity a seasoned apex predator reserves for remarkably stupid prey. Mr. Vance, isn't it? Arthur asked, his voice smooth and lethally calm as he popped the brass latches of his briefcase. I had my paralegal do a quick background check on you this morning. A suspended license in 2 states, multiple ethical violations, and a history of representing desperate, broke clients in probate court. You really should have done your due diligence before you attached your signature to a felony. Mr. Vance's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. Excuse me. Arthur pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal folder and tossed it directly onto the center of the mahogany dining table, right on top of Evelyn's fake will. What you hold in your hand, Mr. Vance, is a worthless piece of forgery, Arthur declared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings with absolute authority. Because Thomas could not possibly have left this house to Evelyn 2 months ago. He hasn't owned this house for 5 years. Evelyn gasped, physically stumbling back a step, her designer stiletto heel catching on the antique rug. That's impossible. Dad owned everything. I know he did. 5 years ago, Arthur continued, turning his commanding gaze to the cash buyer, who was now watching the exchange with deep, alarmed fascination. Thomas, being entirely of sound mind, hired my firm to establish an irrevocable living trust. He permanently transferred the deed to this property, all family business shares, and every single cent of his liquid assets, directly into that trust. He named Clara as the sole, undisputed trustee. The deed was legally recorded with the county half a decade ago. Arthur pulled out the certified, watermarked county deed and slid it smoothly across the table to Mr. Harrington. The wealthy developer adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the official government stamps and signatures. Furthermore, Arthur added, pulling a sleek, high-definition tablet from his briefcase, knowing that his eldest daughter might attempt something exactly like this the moment he passed, Thomas insisted on leaving a visual record. Arthur tapped the screen and turned the tablet around to face the room. The video buffered for a fraction of a second, and then, my father's face filled the screen. He looked a little thinner, confined to his wheelchair in his study, but his eyes were bright, sharp, and blazing with a fierce, protective clarity. Hearing his voice again, strong and unwavering, brought a sudden, hot sting of tears to my eyes, but I stood perfectly still, refusing to let them fall. "My name is Thomas," my father's voice rang out from the tablet, filling the silent dining room. "Today is October 14th, exactly 5 years prior to this viewing. I am recording this statement under the counsel of my attorney, Arthur Sterling. I am legally transferring my entire estate to my youngest daughter, Clara, who has sacrificed everything to care for me. My eldest daughter, Evelyn, has abandoned this family for a life of reckless financial ruin. If Evelyn produces any document, any will, or any contract claiming I have left her my assets, I state right now, for the permanent legal record, that it is a complete forgery. I am leaving Evelyn absolutely nothing." The video clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and utterly devastating. Evelyn looked like she had just been struck by a high-speed train. Her hands were shaking violently. She looked from the dark screen of the tablet to the certified deed in Mr. Harrington's hands, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled out of water. Mr. Harrington, the VIP buyer who had been moments away from wiring millions of dollars, slowly took off his reading glasses. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Evelyn, and then at the sweating, terrified Mr. Vance. "I am a legitimate businessman, Evelyn," Mr. Harrington said, his voice deadly quiet as he picked up his expensive wool coat. "I build luxury properties. I do not deal in stolen assets, and I absolutely do not participate in criminal fraud." "Wait. Mr. Harrington, please." Evelyn shrieked, the sheer, animalistic panic finally breaking through her glamorous high society facade. She lunged forward, desperately grabbing his arm. "There's a misunderstanding. We can renegotiate the terms. I need that deposit today. I absolutely need it." Mr. Harrington forcefully ripped his arm away from her grasp as if she were diseased. "Do not ever contact my firm again. If you or this pathetic excuse for a lawyer call my office, I will have my own legal team report you to the authorities." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final, fatal gunshot through the house. The multi-million-dollar lifeline Evelyn had so desperately counted on to save herself from ruin had just walked out the door, leaving her completely exposed, bankrupt, and entirely trapped. The sound of the heavy oak front door slamming shut behind Mr. Harrington echoed through the house like the final toll of a bell. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The air in the dining room, which just minutes ago had been buzzing with the arrogant anticipation of a multi-million-dollar payday, was now thick with absolute ruin. The expensive, imported champagne that the nervous caterers had poured sat flat and untouched in their crystal flutes. Evelyn stood frozen, staring at the empty hallway where her wealthy salvation had just vanished. I watched in real time as the glamorous, untouchable high society persona she had worn for a decade completely shattered. Her shoulders slumped, her manicured hands began to tremble violently, and a strange, choked sound escaped her throat. Mr. Vance, however, wasn't paralyzed by shock. He was paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that he was about to go to federal prison. The sleazy lawyer practically leaped away from the dining table as if the forged wool resting on it had suddenly caught fire. This has nothing to do with me," Mr. Vance stammered, his voice jumping an octave as he frantically started shoving his papers back into his cheap leather briefcase. His slick, gelled hair was now completely disheveled. He pointed a shaking finger at Evelyn. She told me her father was completely senile. She told me she was the rightful heir and just needed the paperwork backdated to push it through probate. She lied to me. Arthur Sterling didn't even look at the pathetic man. He just slowly adjusted his reading glasses. Ignorance is an incredibly poor defense for forgery, Mr. Vance. Especially when you are actively participating in an attempt to liquidate an $8 million estate. My firm will be forwarding a full copy of this transaction, along with the video evidence, to the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office by 5 o'clock this evening. No, please, you can't. Vance practically whimpered. He didn't even bother to look at Evelyn, the client he had been aggressively defending just 5 minutes prior. He snapped his briefcase shut, the brass lock catching on his sleeve. I'm leaving. I revoke my counsel. Evelyn, you are entirely on your own. Without another word, the rental lawyer scrambled out of the dining room, nearly tripping over the antique Persian rug in his desperation to escape. The front door opened and slammed shut for the second time. And then, there were 3. Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at me. The venom and superiority that had defined her entire existence were completely gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal. She looked at Arthur, standing like an immovable fortress at the head of the table, and then she looked at me, standing tall and resolute in my tailored navy suit. The realization of what I had done, the sheer, meticulous scale of the trap I had laid for her, finally penetrated her panic. Clara, Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out as if reaching for a lifeline. Clara, please. You don't understand. I owe people money. Very dangerous people in Europe. If I don't wire them a massive sum by Monday, they are going to seize everything I have. They might even hurt me. You have to help me. I'm your sister. I stared at the woman who shared my blood. I thought about the 10 grueling years I had spent holding our father's hand while he cried out in pain. I thought about the thousands of nights I had slept on a hard cot next to his medical bed, while she was posting photos of herself drinking cocktails on yachts, ignoring my desperate voicemails. I thought about the forged will and the insulting $5,000 check she had tried to throw at me like a beggar in my own home. You stopped being my sister the day you packed your designer bags and left Dad to die, Evelyn, I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying the heavy weight of a 10-year storm. You didn't care about his pain. You didn't care about my life. You only came back because you smelled blood in the water and thought you could scavenge his corpse to pay off your own pathetic failures. That's not true. I loved him, she shrieked, hot tears of desperation finally spilling down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She lunged forward, desperately trying to grab the certified deed from the table, but Arthur's massive hand slammed down over the document, pinning it to the mahogany wood. Do not touch my client's property, Arthur growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal warning. Evelyn recoiled, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she had been physically struck. She looked around the grand dining room, at the catered luxury food she had bought on credit, at the elegant velvet drapes she had ordered to be torn down. The reality of her total defeat was physically crushing her. She was millions of dollars in debt, facing imminent criminal charges, and she had absolutely nowhere to run. You have exactly 10 minutes, I said, stepping forward until I was standing just inches away from her. I looked directly down into her terrified, tear-streaked face. You have 10 minutes to collect your bags, walk out of my house, and get off my property. If I ever see your face again, if you ever try to contact me, I will personally hand Arthur the authorization to press criminal charges against you for fraud and attempted grand larceny. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, to beg, to try one last desperate act of manipulation. But when she looked into my eyes, she saw absolutely nothing left to exploit. The well of my forgiveness had run entirely dry. Part 8. For a long, agonizing moment, Evelyn just stood there, her expensive designer dress suddenly looking like a poorly fitted costume. She stared at me, her chest heaving, desperately waiting for my hardened expression to crack. She was waiting for the younger sister who had always yielded, the sister who had always absorbed the family's pain to keep the peace. But that sister had died alongside our father. The woman standing before her now was the undisputed owner of this estate, and my patience had completely evaporated. When she finally realized that no salvation was coming, Evelyn let out a broken, pathetic sob. She didn't say another word. She simply turned on her heel, her posture completely defeated, and slowly walked out of the dining room. Arthur and I stood in silence, listening to her heavy, dragging footsteps ascending the grand staircase. The team of caterers, who had been standing frozen in the corner like statues, awkwardly began to pack up their silver platters and crystal champagne flutes. The lavish celebration Evelyn had orchestrated on a mountain of debt was now just a tragic, embarrassing mess. I turned to the head caterer, a nervous young woman who was hurriedly capping a bottle of vintage champagne. "Please, take your time," I said, my voice softening, returning to its normal, gentle cadence. "You and your team will be compensated in full for your time today. Just leave the invoice on the kitchen counter." The woman nodded gratefully, quickly ushering her staff toward the service entrance. 10 minutes later, exactly as I had demanded, the heavy thud of luggage hitting the hardwood floor echoed from the upstairs landing. Evelyn slowly descended the stairs, dragging two massive, incredibly heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases behind her. Her makeup was entirely ruined, streaked with mascara and tears. For the first time in her life, there was no valet to carry her bags. There was no wealthy benefactor holding the door open for her. She had to drag the physical weight of her own vanity down every single step. She reached the foyer, stopping right next to the mountain of cheap, heavy cardboard boxes I had stacked in the hallway over the last 2 days. She paused, her hand gripping the brass doorknob of the front door. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes sweeping over the grand foyer, the antique chandelier, and finally resting on me. "I have nowhere to go, Clara," she whispered, a final, desperate plea for a mercy she had never once shown me. "My credit cards are frozen. I don't even have a hotel booked." "Then I suggest you start walking, Evelyn," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You had a decade to show this family an ounce of compassion. You chose Paris. You chose luxury. Now you get to live with the consequences of your choices." Evelyn's joy tightened. A flash of her old, bitter resentment sparked in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the crushing reality of her absolute ruin. She pushed the heavy oak door open and dragged her bags out into the bright Friday afternoon sun. The door slowly swung shut behind her, the heavy brass latch clicking securely into place. It was over. The silence that washed over the house wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a funeral. It was the clear, resonant silence of a battlefield after the victor has been firmly declared. The toxic, greedy energy that Evelyn had brought into my home had completely vanished, sucked out into the afternoon air. I let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline that had been fueling me for the last 48 hours finally beginning to recede. My knees suddenly felt weak, and I reached out to lean against the mahogany dining table. Arthur Sterling let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. It was a warm, genuine sound that completely shattered the lingering tension in the room. He reached over, picked up the torn, fraudulent will that the sleazy Mr. Vance had abandoned, and neatly slipped it into a plastic evidence sleeve before placing it inside his thick leather briefcase. "I have been practicing law for over 40 years, Clara," Arthur said, a wide, incredibly proud smile spreading across his weathered face. "And I have never, in my entire career, seen an ambush executed with such absolute, surgical precision. Your father would have been unbelievably proud of you today." "I learned from the best, Arthur," I smiled, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. Arthur snapped his briefcase shut and gestured toward the massive pile of taped-up moving boxes sitting in the foyer. "I must admit, you had me worried for a moment when you told me you were packing. I thought you might have actually caved to her timeline before I could get the injunction filed." I laughed, a real, light, unburdened laugh. I walked over to the nearest heavy box, reached into my pocket, and pulled out a small box cutter. With a quick swipe, I sliced through the thick layer of packing tape and pulled the cardboard flaps open. Arthur walked over, peering inside. When he saw the contents, his booming laughter echoed through the entire house. There were no family heirlooms inside. There were no clothes, no antique books, no precious memories. The box was packed to the brim with heavy garden rocks wrapped in last week's newspaper, topped with an absurd amount of useless junk mail. I had built a fortress of absolute garbage right in the center of the hallway, and Evelyn, in all her arrogant superiority, hadn't even bothered to look twice. A masterclass in psychological warfare, Arthur declared, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. She truly thought she had completely broken you. She thought I was weak because I chose to care for the people I love, I said, looking down at the rocks. She never understood that caregiving doesn't make you weak. It makes you unbreakable. Arthur placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. The estate is secure, Clara. The trust is impenetrable. If she or her European creditors ever try to come near this property, my firm will bury them under a mountain of federal litigation. You're safe. The house is yours. When Arthur finally left, I locked the front door behind him. I didn't go upstairs to change out of my power suit right away. Instead, I walked down the hall and slowly opened the heavy oak doors to my father's study. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large window, casting a warm, golden glow over his leather armchair. I walked over and gently rested my hand on the back of the chair. For 10 years, this house had been a hospital, a place of anxiety, medical charts, and impending loss. But today, the shadow had lifted. The legacy my father had worked his entire life to build was safe. I was safe. And as I stood there in the quiet, golden light, I finally allowed the tears to fall, not tears of grief, but tears of absolute, profound freedom. The weekend that followed was the first time in 10 agonizing years that I didn't wake up to the sharp, mechanical beep of a medical monitor or the suffocating dread of an impending crisis. When I opened my eyes on Saturday morning, the house was completely silent, but it wasn't the heavy, mournful silence of a funeral anymore. It was the light, breathable quiet of a sanctuary that had finally been reclaimed. I spent the entire weekend methodically purging the house of the toxic energy Evelyn had dragged into it. I started with the grand dining room. The lavish, expensive spread of imported cheeses and caviar that Evelyn had ordered on credit to celebrate her fraudulent victory was already starting to smell. I swept the crystal champagne flutes and silver platters straight into heavy black garbage bags. It felt incredibly poetic, tossing away the physical manifestations of her fake, glamorous life alongside the actual trash. Next, I tackled the foyer. I carried the heavy cardboard boxes filled with garden rocks and old newspapers out to the dumpster. With every box I threw away, a physical weight seemed to lift from my shoulders. For a decade, my life had been defined by what I had to give up. I had surrendered my 20s, my career, and my independence to be a full-time caregiver. But as I walked through the massive, sunlit rooms of my estate, the reality of my father's irrevocable trust finally began to sink in. I wasn't just safe from eviction. I was a wealthy woman. The trust didn't just hold the deed to the multi-million-dollar property. It held a highly diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and liquid assets that my father had quietly grown over his lifetime. I didn't have to scrape by anymore. I didn't have to wear 12-year-old sweaters or count pennies at the grocery store. My father had ensured that the daughter who gave up her youth to protect him would spend the rest of her life in absolute, unshakable security. Then came Monday. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking a cup of hot coffee and looking out at the old oak tree in the front yard when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Arthur Sterling's name. I answered it immediately, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Good morning, Arthur," I said, my voice relaxed and easy. "Good morning, Clara," Arthur replied, his deep voice crackling with a distinct layer of professional amusement. "I hope you had a restful weekend, because the legal fallout we triggered on Friday has officially hit the ground running. I thought you might want an update on the collateral damage." "I'm listening," I said, setting my mug down. "Let's start with your father's fake attorney, Mr. Vance," Arthur began, the satisfaction evident in his tone. As promised, I forwarded the security footage of his little performance, along with the forged will, to the district attorney and the state bar on Friday evening. Apparently, Mr. Vance is just as much of a coward as he is a criminal. The moment he realized we were actually pressing federal fraud charges, he panicked. He was detained by local authorities late Sunday night, trying to board a cheap commercial flight to Costa Rica. I let out a dry chuckle. He tried to flee the country? He didn't get far, Arthur noted. And the moment they put him in an interrogation room, he immediately flipped. He officially turned state's witness. He gave the authorities a full, recorded confession detailing exactly how Evelyn approached him, how much she paid him up front to backdate the forgery, and her explicit intent to illegally liquidate your father's estate. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Evelyn had truly believed she was a criminal mastermind, but she had built her entire grand scheme with the most incompetent, self-serving accomplices she could find. And what about Evelyn? I asked, the name feeling strange and foreign on my tongue. Friday, she claimed she had a Monday deadline to pay back some very dangerous people in Europe. Arthur let out a heavy sigh. Well, Monday has arrived, and it seems her creditors were not the forgiving type. Evelyn's accounts were completely frozen over the weekend. When the authorities went to serve her with a formal summons for criminal fraud this morning, they didn't find her at a luxury hotel. They found her sitting on the curb outside a cheap, two-star motel on the edge of the city. I closed my eyes, picturing my glamorous, arrogant sister, the woman who had demanded I pack my life into boxes in 48 hours, sitting on a dirty sidewalk with her Louis Vuitton luggage. The authorities formally confiscated her passport, Clara, Arthur continued, his voice turning deadly serious. She is currently being held in county jail awaiting a bail hearing for felony forgery and attempted grand larceny. And frankly, with her European creditors actively seizing whatever properties she illegally leveraged overseas, remaining in a local jail cell might actually be the safest place for her right now. She has absolutely nothing left. Nothing, I repeated softly. The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. She dug her own grave, Clara. She just didn't realize how deep it was until she fell in, Arthur said gently. The estate is entirely shielded from her legal mess. Her debts cannot touch your trust. You are completely insulated. I thanked Arthur and hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, watching the morning sunlight slowly creep across the hardwood floor. There was no triumphant cheering in my heart, but there was no pity either. Karma hadn't just knocked on Evelyn's door, it had kicked it down and stripped her of everything she valued. She had tried to throw me out into the cold with a $5,000 check, and in the end, the universe had handed her the exact same empty, terrifying reality she had designed for me. Part 10 by Wednesday, the massive, four-bedroom historic house finally felt like it truly belonged to me. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't waking up to the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol or the sound of oxygen machines. I spent the morning sitting at my father's great mahogany desk in his study, going through the trust documents with a cup of Earl Grey tea. The sheer scale of the portfolio Arthur Sterling had protected was staggering. My father had built a financial fortress, and now I was its sole commander. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly profitable municipal bond account when the heavy brass telephone on the desk rang. I glanced at the caller ID. It wasn't Arthur. It was a blocked number, accompanied by the unmistakable, automated prefix of the county correctional facility. I let it ring 3 times. A part of me, the old, conditioned Clara, who had spent her entire life trying to keep the peace and fix broken things, wanted to pick it up immediately. But the new Clara, the woman who had stared down a corrupt lawyer and a multi-million-dollar cash buyer without flinching, hesitated. I already knew who was on the other end of that line. I didn't owe her anything. But I also knew that to truly move forward, I needed to close this dark chapter of my life with absolute, undeniable finality. I picked up the receiver. Hello. An inmate at the county correctional facility is attempting to call you, the automated voice buzzed. To accept this collect call, press 1. I pressed 1. Clara? Clara, is that you? Oh my God, please tell me you're there. Evelyn's voice came through the receiver, but it was entirely unrecognizable. The smooth, cultured, transatlantic accent she had spent years perfecting in Paris was completely gone. She sounded frantic, breathless, and utterly terrified, like a cornered rat screeching in the dark. "I'm here, Evelyn," I said, my voice as calm and flat as a pane of glass. "Clara, you have to get me out of here," she sobbed loudly, the sound echoing harshly through the prison phone lines. "It's a nightmare. The food is inedible. They took all my personal belongings, and my cellmate is a violent lunatic. You have to call Arthur Sterling right now. Tell him to post my bail. It's only $1 million, Clara. The trust can easily cover that. Just wire the money to the court, please." I leaned back in my father's leather armchair, staring out the window at the lush, green garden I used to tend while my father watched from his wheelchair. Only $1 million. Even behind bars, stripped of her designer clothes and facing federal prison, Evelyn's sheer, blinding entitlement remained entirely intact. She genuinely believed that after trying to evict me with a fraudulent will, I would simply open my checkbook and save her from the consequences of her own actions. "Evelyn," I said softly, interrupting her frantic rambling. "Why would I ever do that?" There was a sudden, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What? What do you mean why? I am your sister. We are family. You can't just leave your own flesh and blood to rot in a concrete box." "Family?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Where was your concept of family when Dad was screaming in agony because his nerves were failing and I was begging you to come home? Where was your loyalty to your flesh and blood when you walked into the house on the day of his funeral, hired a sleazy lawyer, and threw a forged will in my face? You didn't see me as family, Evelyn. You saw me as an obstacle between you and a cash deposit." I was desperate, she shrieked, her voice cracking with genuine panic. "I owed dangerous people a lot of money, Clara. If I don't get out of here and flee the country, they're going to kill me. I made a mistake, okay? I made a huge mistake. I'm sorry. Just please pay the bail." I closed my eyes, letting the phantom weight of the last 10 years completely wash away. The woman crying on the phone wasn't my sister. My sister had vanished a long time ago, replaced by a greedy, empty shell who worshipped nothing but money and status. And now, that shell was finally cracking. "You didn't make a mistake, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. What you did was calculated, malicious, federal fraud. You looked at the woman who sacrificed a decade of her life to care for our dying father, and you tried to throw her out onto the street with a $5,000 severance check. You gave me 48 hours to pack my bags. Remember? Clara, please." She whimpered, the fight completely draining out of her. "So here is your reality check," I continued, unyielding. "I am not calling Arthur Sterling. I am not touching a single cent of Dad's trust to pay your bail. And I am absolutely not saving you from the European creditors you defrauded. You wanted to live a life of high-stakes luxury and cutthroat business? Well, congratulations. You are finally experiencing how the real world operates." "You can't do this to me," she screamed, a feral sound of absolute despair. "I will never forgive you for this, Clara. Never." "I'm not looking for your forgiveness, Evelyn," I replied calmly. "I'm looking for peace. And for the first time in my life, I finally have it." I didn't wait for her to scream another threat. I didn't wait for the automated system to cut our time short. I simply took the heavy brass receiver and placed it firmly back onto the cradle, severing the connection with a sharp, decisive click. I sat in the quiet study for a long moment, listening to the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I didn't feel a shred of guilt or remorse. I stood up from the desk, walked over to the large bay window, and opened it wide, letting the fresh, crisp morning air flood into the room. The toxic ghost of my sister was permanently banished from this house, locked away in a concrete cell of her own making. The storm was finally over, and the rest of my life was just beginning. 6 months passed since the day I hung up that heavy brass telephone in my father's study. In the outside world, 6 months might not seem like a long time, but inside the walls of my family estate, an entire lifetime had shifted. The sterile, suffocating smell of rubbing alcohol and medical supplies that had haunted the hallways for a decade was completely gone, replaced by the warm scent of vanilla, fresh coffee, and the crisp autumn breeze flowing through the open windows. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't just existing, I was actually living. On a bright Tuesday morning in late October, Arthur Sterling came over for a visit. He didn't bring his intimidating, heavy leather briefcase this time. Instead, he walked up the driveway carrying a box of fresh pastries from a high-end local bakery. I met him at the front door, wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater, and led him into the newly renovated sunroom. I had torn down the heavy, depressing velvet drapes Evelyn had so desperately hated, allowing natural light to flood the space. Arthur took a sip of his tea, looking around the bright room with a warm, approving smile. "The house looks magnificent, Clara. Thomas would be overjoyed to see it full of so much light." "It finally feels like a home again, Arthur," I replied, sitting across from him. "No more ghosts. No more shadows." Arthur nodded, setting his teacup down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single, thin manila folder. "I wanted to deliver the final update to you in person. The legal proceedings concluded yesterday afternoon." I didn't feel the sudden spike of anxiety that usually accompanied the mention of my sister. I just felt a quiet, steady calm. "Tell me." "Evelyn didn't even try to take it to trial," Arthur began, leaning back in his chair. "When her high-priced defense attorney realized her bank accounts had been entirely frozen by international authorities, he dropped her as a client. She was assigned a public defender. Faced with the mountain of evidence we provided, the video confession, the forged document, and Mr. Vance's fully cooperative testimony against her, her public defender strongly advised her to take a plea deal." Arthur opened the folder, looking at the final court decree. Evelyn pled guilty to felony forgery and attempted grand larceny. The judge was not sympathetic to a woman who tried to defraud her grieving sister out of an $8 million estate. She was sentenced to 5 years in a state correctional facility, with no possibility of early parole for the first 3. 5 years. I let the number sink in. The woman who couldn't handle wearing the same designer outfit twice was now going to spend the next 5 years of her life wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, living in an 8x10 concrete cell. "And her financial situation in Europe?" I asked quietly. "Completely decimated," Arthur said, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "The moment she was arrested, those dangerous people she mentioned wasted no time. Her creditors seized her Parisian apartment, liquidated her offshore accounts, and auctioned off every single piece of designer jewelry and art she had left behind to cover her massive debts. When Evelyn finally walks out of those prison gates in a few years, she will be walking out with absolutely nothing but a criminal record. She is entirely, irreparably bankrupt." As for Mr. Vance, Arthur informed me that the sleazy lawyer's plea deal hadn't saved him from ruin. In exchange for his testimony, he avoided federal prison, but he was permanently disbarred, heavily fined, and sentenced to 3 years of probation. His career was completely destroyed. "It's over, Clara," Arthur said gently, closing the folder and sliding it across the glass table. "The chapter is officially closed." After Arthur left, I took the manila folder and walked down to the basement, locking it away in an old filing cabinet. I didn't need to look at it again. I didn't need to gloat over Evelyn's downfall. The universe had simply balanced the scales, delivering the exact, ruthless karma she had earned. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. The last time I was here, it was pouring rain, and Evelyn was complaining about the humidity ruining her hair while I stood frozen in exhausted grief. Today, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The autumn leaves were turning vibrant shades of gold and crimson, drifting lazily in the wind. I knelt by my father's grave and placed a fresh bouquet of white roses against the headstone. I didn't cry. My tears had dried up months ago. Instead, I sat on the cool grass and just talked to him. I told him about the house renovations. I told him about the massive financial portfolio that was continuing to grow under Arthur's guidance. And then I told him about my new plan. I'm not going to just sit in that big house and hoard this wealth, "Dad," I whispered, tracing the engraved letters of his name. "I spent 10 years learning how hard it is to care for someone you love when the medical system turns its back on you. I know what it feels like to be isolated, exhausted, and terrified of the next hospital bill." I took a deep breath, the vision of my future finally crystallizing in my mind. "I've instructed Arthur to draft the paperwork to establish a charitable foundation in your name. We are taking a significant portion of the trust's annual yields and using it to provide financial grants, respite care, and professional nursing support for low-income families who are acting as full-time caregivers for their terminally ill relatives. I am going to make sure that no daughter ever has to sacrifice her entire youth just to keep her father comfortable. I'm going to turn our pain into someone else's miracle." A gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees, almost as if my father was answering me. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the crushing weight of obligation. I felt purpose. Evelyn had tried to reduce my worth to a $5,000 check and a pile of cardboard boxes. She thought my compassion was my greatest weakness. She was entirely wrong. My compassion was the very thing that had saved me, and now it was going to save countless others. Exactly 1 year to the day after my father's funeral, I stood in the bright, bustling lobby of a newly renovated office building downtown. The bronze plaque next to the glass double doors read, "The Thomas Endowment for Family Caregivers." It wasn't just a tax write-off or a hollow vanity project. Over the past 12 months, with Arthur Sterling's meticulous legal guidance, we had transformed a massive portion of my father's multi-million-dollar trust into a fully operational, federally recognized charitable foundation. We had hired a dedicated team of social workers, financial advisors, and medical liaisons. Our mission was simple, but profound: to find the daughters, the sons, and the spouses who were drowning in the invisible, crushing weight of full-time caregiving, and throw them a permanent lifeline. I was standing near the reception desk when a young woman walked in. She couldn't have been older than 25, but she carried herself with the heavy, exhausted shuffle of someone carrying the weight of the world. She wore a faded, oversized cardigan, and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes told a story I knew intimately. I gently guided her into my office and poured her a cup of warm tea. Her name was Maya. For the last 3 years, she had put her college degree on hold to care for her mother, who was battling early-onset Alzheimer's. Maya was completely out of money, facing eviction, and utterly terrified that she would have to surrender her mother to a state-run facility because she couldn't afford the home nursing care. As she wept, apologizing for breaking down, I didn't just offer her empty sympathies. I reached across the desk and handed her a thick, pristine white folder. "Maya," I said softly, looking directly into her tired eyes. "Inside this folder is a fully approved, comprehensive grant. The foundation is covering the complete cost of a licensed, round-the-clock home nurse for your mother for the next 2 years. We are also issuing you a monthly financial stipend so you can pay your rent, buy your groceries, and finally go back to school." Maya stared at the paperwork, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the folder. She looked up at me, a look of absolute, breathless disbelief washing over her face. I don't understand. Why are you doing this for me? I can never repay this." I smiled, feeling a profound, radiant warmth bloom in the center of my chest. "You don't have to repay it, Maya. A very wise, very generous man left behind a legacy to ensure that no one has to choose between loving their family and losing their own future. Go home. Go get some sleep. You aren't alone anymore." When Maya left my office, clutching that folder to her chest like it was a shield, I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. My father's wealth hadn't just secured my life, it was actively rewriting the tragedies of countless others. That was the true power of a legacy. It wasn't about hoarding gold, it was about building a fortress for those who couldn't defend themselves. Later that afternoon, as I was packing up my briefcase to head home, my assistant handed me the day's mail. Mixed in with the foundation's standard envelopes was a thick, cheap yellow envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. The sharp, aggressive cursive belonged to Evelyn. In the top left corner was the unmistakable red stamp of the state penitentiary. It had been 6 months since she was sentenced. This was the first time she had attempted to contact me. I stared at the envelope for a long time. A year ago, a letter from my older sister would have sent my heart racing with anxiety, guilt, or anger. I would have agonized over every word, wondering what new manipulation or cruelty she was trying to inflict. But as I held that cheap yellow paper in my hands, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. The anger had completely burned out, and the well of my empathy for her was permanently dry. She had made her choices. She had chosen greed over compassion, forgery over family, and arrogance over humility. She was living in a concrete cell, stripped of her designer clothes, her wealth, and her freedom, completely alone with the consequences of her own horrific actions. I didn't open the letter. I didn't need to know what lies, apologies, or threats she had written inside. I simply picked up a red pen from my desk, wrote "Return to Sender" in bold letters across the front, and dropped it into the outgoing mail bin. She belonged in my past, and I was entirely focused on the future. When I drove up the winding driveway of the family estate that evening, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a brilliant, golden glow over the manicured lawns. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. I stood in the exact spot in the foyer where, 1 year ago, Evelyn had demanded I pack up my entire life into cardboard boxes. I stood in the exact spot where that sleazy fake lawyer had threatened me with a forged document. The ghosts of their greed were completely gone. The air in the house was light, filled with the scent of fresh jasmine from the garden and the peaceful, unbroken silence of a true sanctuary. I walked into my father's old study, leaving the door wide open. I sat down in his leather armchair, feeling completely at home. Evelyn thought that my 10 years of caregiving had made me a weak, pathetic target. She thought that because I didn't wear a corporate power suit or sip champagne in Paris, I was easy prey. But she learned the hard way that the deepest strength doesn't come from a bank account, and the sharpest weapon isn't a forged piece of paper. The most impenetrable fortress a person can build is a clear conscience. I looked at the framed photograph of my father resting on the mahogany desk. He was smiling. And finally, after 10 long years of sacrifice, struggle, and a war I never asked for, I smiled back. Thank you for listening to my story. If you ever find yourself in the darkest hours of caregiving, sacrificing your own light to keep someone else warm, remember this: your compassion is not a weakness. It is your greatest armor. And to those who try to exploit the vulnerable for their own greedy gain, just remember, the truth always leaves a paper trail, and karma never misses its target. Until next time, stay strong and always protect your peace.